Okay, so hi everybody. I'm Sally from Prairie Lights, and I'm very, very excited to introduce today's Black Authors panel in celebration of the Soul and Blues Festival here in Iowa City. We have a really amazing discussion. We'll be hearing from Gerald Walker, Dr. Mary Hicks, and Venice Berry. And it is absolutely my pleasure to introduce our wonderful moderator, Arnold Daniels Jr., who'll be introducing our authors today in a bit. But a bit about Arnold himself first. Arnold Daniels Jr. is a former U.S. State Department liaison. He is an anthropologist, entrepreneur, educator, and volunteer with the African American Museum of Iowa. Mr. Daniels has taught anthropology, criminal justice, cultural geography, English, history, and sociology at several East Coast colleges and universities. A longtime resident of Washington, D.C., he now makes his home in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. Um, so that is quite an impressive resume there, Mr. Daniels. There's also, I just want to let all the audience members know that there's a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. You'll see it if you hover over your screen. You can feel free to ask questions for any of our panelists at any point during the conversation, and we'll get to them at the Q&A portion at the end of the conversation. But for now, I'm going to hand it off to Mr. Daniels and let you all get started.
Let me continue the welcome to the 2021 Soul and Blues Festival Black Authors panel. I'm Arnold Daniels Jr., as has been said, and I'm your moderator. Our first professor is Professor Venice T. Berry, who's the Professor of African American Studies and Journalism at the University of Iowa in Iowa City. And she has, with the book we're discussing today, is Racialism and the Media, Black Jesus, Black Twitter, and the first Black American president. The second speaker is Professor Mary E. Hicks, who is an assistant professor at the University of Chicago, and we're going to be talking about her contribution to the book 400 Souls, A Community History of African Americans, 1619 to 2019. And our third speaker is Professor Gerald Walker, a professor of creative writing at Emerson College, and the title of his book is Making a Slave and Other Essays. So why don't we start off with a 2 to 3 minute introduction by each of our professors, and we will begin with Professor Venice Berry.
Thank you. I want to share my screen. As you said, I'm a professor of journalism and African American Studies at the University of Iowa. I've been here for over 20 years. I've been here a while. And my research for the last 20 years has explored race and the media. And particularly, what I wanted to do was examine the images and messages about race that are perpetuated in the media. And I came up with this concept. One of the things that was bothering me was that everything is not racist, in my opinion. And I think that because in the 21st century, there's a normalization of racialized images and messages, and they impact cultural representation. And so we all buy in. And so I'm actually redefining racism in my book as something that better deals with something that's malicious, that's offensive, it's purposeful, something that's purposeful. Basically, do you want me to continue or do you want to ask questions? I'm not sure how you want to
Continue.
Okay. So what I would like to do is just take a few minutes to explain racialism and give you a few examples so that you know what I'm trying to do, or at least what I'm thinking about in relation to this notion. And hopefully everybody can see. The definition is, racialism involves racial ideas, images, and issues that are produced, distributed, and consumed repetitively and intertextually. Basically, what I'm looking at is 4 components: stereotypes, biased frames, historical myths, and then traditional racism is also included under that umbrella. And basically, I'm exploring how they're normalized and accepted in this society, particularly based on the media presentation or the media portrayals. Ultimately, these media representations shape and influence societal ideology and behavior, in my opinion. So what I want to do is just simply go to the next. Okay, I want to give you an example of each one in relation to racialism. So this is a stereotype example. And you see the young man and young woman are in a Kool-Aid ad. Now, the interesting thing about this is that, you know, they're sitting on a stoop, they're, you know, it says old school flavor, so they're based in the past. But one of the things that caught my eye, which the average person would probably just ignore, is the fact that his foot is on a basketball. And I just said, wow, that's interesting, because he doesn't have on tennis shoes. He's not on a basketball court. So somebody in creating this image said, oh, you know what? We need to put a basketball in this shot. Now, is that racist? It is a stereotype, but is it racist? Those are the kinds of things I'm trying to look at in my book. And I don't think it is. I think it's racialism, which is a stereotypical idea or image that's been accepted and is being perpetuated in our society. And the interesting thing about this is that it's not just other cultures, but Black cultures. Black people buy into these stereotypes as well. This is an example of biased framing. Fox Nation created a story during President Obama's presidency, and he was having his 50th birthday party at the White House. And this is how they framed it. Obama's hip hop barbecue didn't create jobs. And they had 4 Black men. Only one of them is connected to hip hop, that's Jay-Z. And then of course, Chris is a comedian, the president, and then Charles Barkley, who's an athlete. But the interesting thing is, when you tie 4 Black men to hip hop, and we know that particularly in the Fox Nation, in the Republican or the conservative nation, hip hop is not seen as a positive element. Or even barbecue is kind of a way to, I guess, lower or create a kind of inferior notion. So the frame is problematic here. Historical myth. This is an example of Naomi Campbell. She did a fashion shoot in Africa, and the logo or the title was Wild Things. Now, the interesting thing about historical myth, the reason why I think that's important, and I wanted to pull it out for the racialism concept, is whenever we think about Africa, there's always these ideas of savage, wild, uncivilized. And so even, and what I wanted to show here is, as a part of racialism, even in something as simple as a fashion shoot, when you connect it to those ideas, wild things, and again, like I said, Africa, and you think about wild and uncivilized and savage, it ties into that historical myth. Now, some people would argue that that's racist. I don't. I feel like that's not what I'm calling traditional racism. So the final example for traditional racism, this is a bumper sticker that was put out during President Obama's re-election campaign. Don't renege. And we all know that renege is shorthand for the N-word. That, to me, the purposeful, the offensive, the malicious, that is traditional racism. And it's still alive and well. I'm not saying it's gone anywhere, but I'm saying that we really need to think about images and messages from a more nuanced perspective. And that's what my book, Racialism in the Media, basically strives to do. And that's it.
Thank you, Professor Berry. I'd like to move on to Professor Hicks, and why don't you begin?
Thank you. So I'm going to quickly talk about my short piece in 400 Souls, which is a volume that recently came out. It was edited by Keisha Blaine and Ibram Kendi, two scholars of African-American history. So really their focus was on bringing together about 90 Black authors to narrate the history of the African diaspora at large. Most of the pieces are about the United States, but there are some pieces that are about West Africa and the Caribbean as well, or connections to the Caribbean. So my piece was called The Middle Passage, and it really focused on three themes. So the first theme was the dynamic of the rapid expansion of oceanic slaving on the West African coast, following the introduction of imperial competition. So it doesn't take place, it takes place in 1695. It's not the very beginning of the transatlantic slave trade. The transatlantic slave trade actually begins in the 1440s. But this is the period in which you see competition between Portuguese, French, English, and Dutch imperial powers really driving the expansion of the transatlantic slave trade. And so my chapter specifically focuses on the Gold Coast because I was interested in connecting the violence of slaving with market competition. So around this period, about 5,000 men, women, and children were actually embarked annually from West Africa. And this is a moment in which there's a high degree of royal or state involvement in the transatlantic slave trade. So one of the things I discuss is the asiento, which is an actual contract between the state and private traders, merchants, to provide enslaved people for New World plantations. So I try to understand the sort of commercial and political framework in which you see this explosion of slaving. And the final theme of my short piece is about the sort of middlemen themselves. I call them maritime middlemen. And these are the seafarers who on their canoes are ferrying goods back and forth from the West African coast to European sailing vessels who are anchored out further at sea. Oftentimes, they couldn't come too close to the coast because of the depth of the ocean floor there. And the reason why I focused on these very individuals is because I wanted to understand what would basically encourage people, induce people to participate in such a violent, ethically horrific act, right? Which was the act of transatlantic slaving. And these are African canoemen. They basically earn wages from ferrying people back and forth, but they also trade on their own behalf, right? So this participation in the transatlantic slave trade allows them to buy European trade goods and then sell them in West African communities. I have an image as well that I just want to show very quickly so you can get a sense of these canoemen. So these are the canoemen themselves. And you can see that this is an image from a little bit later than the period, or sorry, a little bit earlier than the period I'm talking about, but you can see, you can see the number of canoes, just the number of canoes you have surrounding these great European vessels, which are the type of vessels we tend to associate with the transatlantic slave trade. But my argument is that you really can't understand the trade without looking at these smaller vessels as well, because the knowledge that these canoemen had of the currents basically allowed merchants to ferry goods and people from ship to shore. So I will end there to give us all time for questions, and I look forward to discussing this issue, this topic with all of you.
Professor Walker.
Thank you, Mr. Daniels. Thank you for the invitation to participate on this panel. I am a writer. I attended the Iowa Writers Workshop And my last time at Prairie Lights was, I think, 2010 when my first book came out. I studied fiction writing, but I have transitioned to higher ground, which is to say I write nonfiction now. And my collection of essays explores parenting, race, academia, and a host of issues that in some ways intersect with race, racialism, and stereotypes. So I'm very interested in Professor Berry's presentation. In fact, as I was listening to it, instead of rambling for my 5 minutes or so, which I'm off to a good start at doing, I thought maybe I would just read a couple of pages of one of my essays, which kind of ties into some of the themes we've heard so far. It's a short essay. I probably could squeeze the whole thing in, but I won't torture you in that way. I'll read a couple of pages and then we can open it up. The essay is called Thieves. Whole food shoppers are easy targets, so busy choosing their imported wheat germ and organic kiwi that they forget about thieves. They are also wealthy, at least the ones who live in this town on the shore, where the median home value is $1 million and the cars are typically high end, like the Mercedes I park my Toyota next to. I am a good 60 yards from the store's entrance, far enough to complicate a getaway, I note, though by no means making it impossible. Security is light, and the odds of a passerby confronting a running black man are slim. I prefer coming here mid-morning on a weekday when it's not very crowded, and that will be especially true now since it has been drizzling for the last hour. Once I am inside, the weather works further in my favor, allowing me to spend several seconds wiping my feet while surveying carts for unattended purses. Right off, I see two directly near my path near the apricots. A few feet beyond those, there is another by the corn on the cob. The purse's owners are steps away, their backs to me as they make their overpriced selections. I could have the purses and be gone in a flash. Instead, I remain by the door holding my grocery list close to my face, studying it intensely, offering the possibility that I am a mere dutiful spouse, struggling to decipher my wife's scribble. The corn gatherer isn't falling for it. We've made eye contact and now she returns to her cart, deposits her corn, and then lifts her purse and slips it over her shoulder. The apricot pickers haven't noticed me. I pry a shopping basket from the stack. Against my better judgment, I hurry forward, triggering what I sometimes imagine is an ultrasonic alarm. The two women I'm approaching dart glances over their shoulders, seeing me before I have a chance to reach them, and move to secure their belongings. Another woman, elderly, slightly stooped, light reflecting off the gem, squeezing her pudgy fingers, appears at my side, talking about arugula. You used to keep it by the broccoli, she is saying. It was there just last week. Pardon me? The arugula, where did you move it? I don't work here, I say. She looks confused. He can probably help you. I point to a man watering daisies. Like all the store employees, he is wearing a brown apron with Whole Foods printed in large lettering across the front. I am wearing a blazer, shirt, tie, and stone-washed jeans. A style, according to one of my graduate students, known as smart casual. A prideful part of me wants to mention this to the elderly woman, emphasizing that I am a college professor, but I say nothing as she goes to the produce clerk, who leads her to a field of greens with labels identifying the species. Perhaps I only look casual, and a bunch of arugula will complete the ensemble. The thought occurs to me in jest, but nonetheless I act on it. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to ask Professor Berry a question. You talk about the concept of you're seeing some of your work through the lens of critical race theory. Would you elaborate on that, please?
Well, one of the things, of course, critical race theory is very controversial at this moment. And one of the things, of course, that it started the history, it started in the legal field, and it's blossomed out into sociology, communication, history, other areas that are now thinking about, how do we influence, how do we change, the systematic kinds of racial problems, racial issues that we're all dealing with. And so what this book is trying to do is really take the notion of critical race theory and look at it in relation to media and how systematically the media um, gives us images and messages about race, about African Americans, um, that are problematic, that are challenging, that are interesting, that are, just images that we buy into as well. Normalized images that we accept, like I said, not just other cultures, but African Americans accept them as well. We we focus on. I mean, we laugh at stereotypes. We, watch shows that have negative kind of bias frames, and so it's just really a way to shape my research so that it really um, takes aim at this systematic notion of media and race, how media impacts or influences race in our society. And I do want to say my research focuses on African Americans, but a lot of times when you think about race, you really, and the media, you can look at Hispanics, you could look at Native American issues, images and messages. You can look at Asian images and messages and see similar kinds of problems or issues.
Thank you. Professor Hicks, when we talked a day or so ago about your writing, I used the word complicit in terms of the Africans' involvement with the slave trade. You don't use, do you consider it such a controversial topic, or do you feel as though they were complicit?
Yeah, this is a question that I was looking for because I think it is really counterintuitive for us to think about African people participating in the transatlantic slave trade, right? We tend to think of African people as the victims, as the commodified individuals within that transatlantic commercial system, not necessarily the brokers, not necessarily the merchants, or not necessarily the labor force. So I have a bigger project which is about African seamen in the South Atlantic slave trade from the 18th to the early 19th century, in which they provided at least 40% of the labor force in the transatlantic slave trade to Salvador, Brazil. And I don't necessarily use that term just because I think that what I'm trying to get at with my work is if we understand transatlantic slaving as a commercial system, right, a capitalist system of exploitation and actually extraction of profits, because all these people would end up working on American plantations or other, American, sometimes they would end up in cities, a small number of them, to produce goods that would then be sold back to Europe for profit, right? So the point of the transatlantic slave trade is the production of profit, but also the enlargement of European imperial territories, right? Enslaved people would be used to settle new American territories as part of European imperial projects. So if we understand these people as being caught up in systems of power, which we all are, right? We make decisions not with every choice open to us, right? We have a limited set of choices by nature of the very structures of power that govern and shape our lives, right? So for these canoemen, they see a commercial opportunity and they benefit from it. Other people have, I would say, less agency, right? Because they themselves are enslaved. So they don't have a lot of say in what kinds of ends their labor would be put towards. But then what ends up happening in this system, which we can probably recognize from our own difficult choices that we make in life, which sometimes we may feel that we aren't resisting or contesting unethical systems of power as much as we would like to. But what they do is they try to find some benefit from being coerced into these situations as enslaved mariners working in the transatlantic slave trade. So I would say, for me, I don't see it as complicity. I see it as people negotiate these fields of power in which we all exist, and sometimes you can't necessarily end something like the transatlantic slave trade, but you can benefit from it as an individual, right? And that's the kind of limit of your agency, of your power in shaping this system.
Thank you. Professor Walker, the title of your book is How to Make a Slave and Other Essays. Were you talking about making yourself a slave or your children a slave? Was that a metaphor for co-opting into the system?
No, certainly not making myself or my kids slave. I think broadly I was referring to anyone who would have some concept or idea govern their lives to the extent that they make poor decisions. And what I was referring to, and the title essay of the collection, is an example of me being so obsessed with racism and the possibility of racism that it made me paranoid, and it was influencing my ability to parent my children effectively. So I had become a slave to my fears and paranoias, and that resulted in me, making some pretty poor decisions. To specifically talk about that essay, one of my kids, I think he was 5 years old at the time, came home from school and told his mom that a kid at school had said, boys or children with his skin color are stinky. My wife was upset about it, but not to the extent that I was. Kids being kids, she said, they say these things. Kids also being kids forget these things. And she was certain that our 5-year-old in a day's time would have completely forgotten about it. That turned out to be true. I, 30 years later, am writing an essay about it. So it has remained with me. And at the time, it remained with me so much that I found myself, I don't want to use the word spying, but let's say spying on my children to see if I could detect the damage that this young girl had done to them.
Professor Berry, you use a concept called intersectionality. And I'd like for you to elaborate upon that, how that affects stereotypes.
Well, intersectionality is a concept that has become very popular in a variety of areas of research. And it basically talks about the fact that there are certain characteristics that intersect. So I am a woman. I am an African-American woman. I would be considered I don't know, I don't think I'd be upper class, but my class is higher than just an average person because I'm a college professor. It's actually expanded into looking at the fact that, various cultural areas that you live in. You come from a certain area, or you're Southern or you're Eastern or Midwestern, which I am. And so when you look at me and you think about who I am, you can't just say, I'm Black or I'm a woman or, I'm a professor, because I'm all of those things, and all of those things intersect. They all create the person that I am. And that concept I actually use in a chapter where I'm looking at the movie Crash. And if you have not seen that movie, I just think it's excellent. I love that movie. So, while we're still dealing with these COVID issues and people are binging, that's a movie to look at, Crash, because they do such a wonderful job. It's set in LA and it's looking at stereotypes and biases and historical myths and other kinds of issues, traditional racism as well. And it's really trying to help us understand how complicated people are, that they're not just that stereotype. They're not just how you see them in that biased frame. They have all these different contradictions that we need to think about. And it's a wonderful movie. It does a fabulous job of, I think, dealing with intersectionality and showing the importance of thinking about intersectionality when we think about people. So, like I said, that's kind of in the context that I use it.
Professor Hicks, you talk about the slave, more of your specialty deals with the Portuguese involvement in Brazil and South America. Could you elaborate upon that a bit?
Yeah, so one of the things that I discovered in the course of my education was actually at the University of Iowa, where I was a student, an undergraduate student many years ago, was that in fact the place, the region which received the greatest number of enslaved people from Africa, and that's including West Africa and West Central Africa, places like Congo and Angola, is Brazil. Right? And the United States received a much smaller number of enslaved people via the transatlantic slave trade than Brazil did. So Brazil received something like 40% of the over 12 million people who were violently trafficked to the Americas, while the United States, what is now the United States, received a much smaller proportion, something like 5%, 4 or 5%. So what I was really interested in when I got into this work was to try to examine a place, a slave society that was very much influenced by African cultures, worldviews, social logics, and try to understand how that played out in the system of slavery. And so I settled on writing about mariners because in the course of my research, I was in Lisbon at the time. I was in the archives and I found a letter from 1797 by 4 African sailors. And these sailors were petitioning the Portuguese crown, who did at this moment at times grant enslaved people their manumission, their freedom. And they were making a claim that because they were so vital to the Portuguese imperial project through their naval service, that they should be freed from slavery. And they made reference to something they called natural liberty, their natural liberty. And so I was just really interested in, what kind of world produced this idea by these 4 African seamen who had, sort of begun as enslaved people. Their lives had begun as enslaved people. They were eventually taken as prisoners of war on a French ship. They then ran away, ended up back on a Portuguese ship, but as enslaved people again. What shaped the worldview of these men? So that's really what I try to understand in my forthcoming book, which is called Captive Cosmopolitans, Black Mariners in the World of South Atlantic Slavery, is try to understand what role these men had in shaping the South Atlantic slave system, which was the largest in the Atlantic. It involved the greatest number of people, and it lasted the longest because it stretched from the 1440s, basically, which is when the Portuguese first become involved in the transatlantic slave trade, to the 1850s. So that's over 400 years. And those are the kind of questions that drove my research and writing in my project. So I hope that answered your question, Arnold.
Professor Walker, I want to ask you about the chapter Return to the Ghetto. Um, how did that really reshape your you were very concerned about how your sons would take this experience.
I was. I was also concerned about how I would take that experience. I was raised on the south side of Chicago. And when I came of age in the 80s and 90s, it was a very, very dangerous place. And one would think, based on the news reports recently, that it's more dangerous now than it was when I was in my late teens. It's not true. It turns out that when I was growing up, it was much more dangerous, much more violent, many more guns, a lot more drugs. But the impression you get from watching news reports and from hearing the former guy, our last president, Chicago was a war zone. And so after my children were bombarded with these images on the news, and I received them as well, we developed a very robust fear of returning to Chicago, which I hadn't been to for quite some time. And the occasion for this visit was my mother's 80th birthday. So there was no getting out of it. All my prior excuses simply wouldn't hold up this time. So we were going to Chicago and we were worried about it. And once we, to sweeten it for my children a little bit, we spent the week in downtown Chicago and on the Gold Coast and these very sort of affluent areas, just to make sure we were balancing the experience with some activities that wouldn't cause us as much anxiety. But the time came where we had to hop in the car and drive back to the hood. And my sons, I was driving, so I couldn't really see them, but I imagined them hugging each other in the back of the car as we drove through these streets, because they've been raised in these predominantly white communities, and they don't have a whole lot of experience with a community like this outside of Chicago. So they had fully bought into the stereotypes. I had bought into the stereotypes despite the fact that I knew from experience that they were not true. I was raised in this place and came out of it enjoying my cultural experience, recognizing the value in it, the beauty of it, the unity of it, and all the positive things that never make the evening news. But I had been away for so long that those things start to fade. And what takes its place are the stereotypes. So it wasn't until we returned that we drove into the heart of the inner city on the south side of Chicago. We attended my mother's birthday party. Everything was fine. And the time came for us to depart. And I thought, we made it. This is great. And we were about to walk out the door, and my twin brother came to me and said, "You can't leave yet. Let's have one more beer." I said, "Oh, okay, I'll have one more beer." And then he said, "We can't, we're out. We have to go get some more." The problem was he wanted to walk to the liquor store 3 blocks away in the dark of night in the ghetto. And I was terrified. So suddenly all of my fears came flying back. And I was faced with the decision of rejecting my brother's request, revealing myself to have completely sold off to these false notions of this community, which I had just about done, or going with him. And so I went. And it brought back all of my memories of being raised in that community. I started getting my strut back, and then we got into the store, and I was using the slang, and I felt, this is great. What was I worried about? And so we picked up our beer, and as we were returning back to my mother's place, 5 guys dressed in the stereotypical attire of baggy jeans and baggy shirts and gold chains and all of that were approaching us. And I almost ran. I was very worried about what was about to go down. And I was trying to pretend as if I wasn't concerned about it, because my brother didn't seem to be concerned about it, but I assumed maybe he was pretending too, but he genuinely wasn't concerned about it because he has never left that community. So he hasn't bought into the stereotypes that someone who was away from that community might buy into. So he wasn't concerned at all. I was concerned. The guys were approaching, we were approaching the guys. My brother and I were chatting. The guys stopped chatting. They looked up at us and they said, "What's up, brothers?" And we said, "Not much." And they said, "Have a good day." And we said, "You too." And we walked right by them. And it occurred to me that that exchange, that display of humanity, was what I had been nourished on as a child in that community, not the stereotypes. And it took that encounter, that incident, to remind me of all the goodness of this place that I had begun to forget. And so when we got back to my parents' house, the story that I told my sons was of that exchange. And I began to try to have stories such as that replace the ones that had created their fear of this community needlessly.
We have some questions from the audience. James P. had put forth a question. Can you re-ask your question in the chat, in the Q&A because I've lost it. It's scrolled up too far. I have a question from James P., I think his name was. Please resubmit your question. Diane Henry has a question for all the panelists. Her question is, by making the distinction between racialism and racism in contemporary society, how is the Black life experience actually enhanced?
Well, one of the things that I argue is that nobody wants to be called a racist, especially if they don't believe they are, and nobody wants to be said they're practicing racism if they don't believe they are. So one of the problems we have is when we just automatically, see something and call somebody a racist, it shuts down the conversation. It stops the ability to discuss whatever the issues are. And like I said, and the other thing is that I don't believe a lot of these incidents are racism. I don't know, but I don't think the person who put the basketball under the young Black boy's foot is a racist. So to look at that image and say, oh, this is racism. Oh, it creates, I think, a problem in how we deal with these kinds of issues. The goal of my book is not to let racists and racism off the hook, but it's rather, I want to expose, I want to deconstruct, I want to critique various factors of race in the media so that we can maybe provoke a kind of change when it comes to these kinds of problematic racial images and messages that we've all come to know and love. And until we're aware, until everybody is skimming through that magazine and they see that basketball and say, oh, that shouldn't be there, or that doesn't need to be there, we can't have that discussion. And then, of course, one of the things I also say all the times is that being a college professor, particularly a professor at a predominantly white institution, Black people alone cannot fix this problem. It takes everybody. And so in my classes, which a lot of them are predominantly white, a lot of my Afro-American classes are mixed, half and half, usually people of color and white students. And so I want the white students to understand that it's part of their responsibility to pay attention to see these kinds of issues, because they may be the person creating that ad. And somebody else may say, oh, let's put a basketball under his foot. And they need to say, no, that's not necessary. Let's not do that. So again, just making the change is part of what I'm trying to have us begin to think about. And we can't do that until we stop, attacking each other. And that's what I think, calling people racists or telling people, that they're practicing racism, when in reality, it's a stereotype that we've all, like I said, come to know and love. So we're not doing it as racist, or they may not be doing it as a racist or practicing racism.
Professor Walker, you have a quote in your book about how you run your classes. and you ask your students to look at the strength of the victim, the person who's normally considered the victim. And you say not to focus on white cruelty, but to focus on Black resilience, essentially. Would you elaborate on that a bit?
Sure.
In connection with this question.
Yep. My book is dedicated to James Allen McPherson, the longtime faculty member at the Writers' Workshop who passed away a couple of years ago. When I first encountered him, I think in '94, maybe in one of my first workshops, he recognized something in my work that he thought would be harmful to my development as a writer. And that was that I was focusing, in fact, on white cruelty rather than how Blacks have responded to it. And that he pointed out that if I had focused on that solely as an individual, I would not have made it to be in the classroom before him, that I had to have been drawing on some positive attributes of Black culture and Black society that enabled me to make it out of the community that I referenced earlier. And he wanted me to see more of that in my work, show more of it in my work. And so I worked with him for a few years, and he turned me on to like-minded thinkers like Ralph Ellison and Albert Murray, who talked about the importance of focusing not so much on the dragons, but the dragon slayers. And the essay in the piece that I write about James Allen McPherson is in fact to that point, that African Americans, by virtue of surviving hundreds of years of brutalization, by necessity had to be more than the sum of that brutalization. And he wanted me to show, because I agree with it, I came to agree with it, that that approach will produce literature that gets at something much more than simply how Blacks have been harmed and mistreated. It will get at how Blacks have responded and defeated. And that, I almost tapped into a little Jesse Jackson there with that rhyme, didn't I? But so my work then became focused on African-American survival, African-American strength, African-American endurance and courage. I'm way more likely to write about any subject from that perspective than from the perspective of what was done to us.
Thank you, Professor Walker. You have received a compliment from James P. This is a really powerful story, Dr. Walker. Thanks for sharing James P.'s comment.
Thank you.
I don't know if James P. is asking all the panelists. He says that's a good point. Many media outlets are driving a sense of urban chaos in Chicago now for their own purposes of bias. Any comments from the panel? Professor Hicks, you're now in Chicago.
Yeah, it does. I don't think about urban chaos. So yeah, I mean, I guess Professor Berry probably has much more to say about this because it's about media representations. And as she's pointed out, there are frameworks, there are tropes that get repeated over and over to try to affect a certain kind of politics. To my mind, there are historians who write about this issue as either a form of front lash, right, which is basically a political pushback against an advance you think African Americans are going to make, right? So it actually precedes the actual, triumph itself. And I think a lot of the media depictions of critical race theory, of urban chaos, as the comment on the Q&A chat said, are referring to is this idea that, municipal politics especially are on the verge of transformation because of the Black Lives Matter movement, and that people are proactively pushing against that. So that's my sort of reading of these narratives that are circulating now that I don't think are very accurate.
Professor Walker, do you have anything you'd like to add about this particular question?
Um,
Urban chaos?
I'm sorry, the urban chaos?
That's a good point. Many media outlets are driving a sense of urban chaos in Chicago now for their own purposes of bias.
Right. Well, that was the subject of my essay, Returning Once More to the Ghetto, that we went right into the storm of those stereotypes and discovered them to be false.
Professor Berry, would you like to comment?
Well, the same person, James, asked a question about critical race theory and the whole, the conservative backlash and that kind of thing. And, it's just interesting to me that they've taken this concept and reframed it into this problematic area in relation to saying, critical race theory is telling kids K through 12 that all of them are bad, all white people are bad, and all, systems are bad. And that's really not the case. It's really simply trying to have us understand how certain systems are put together in a way that some people benefit and some people don't. Some people have advantages over other people. And so it's in understanding this, it doesn't make anybody any better than anybody else. It just helps us to change the problematic system. So I think that that's interesting in the sense that, they've taken this concept way out of context and, pushed it kind of similar to what Gerald had talked about with the stereotypes of the South Side of Chicago, where everybody's scared to go into the South Side of Chicago. Well, everybody's, not everybody, but a lot of people are now negative about critical race theory because, oh my God, it tells white kids that they're bad and that they're a problem. And that's not even the case. But again, it's this thing of the media and misinformation it's really scary how powerful it has shown us the media is in relation to certain people. And we've got to get a handle on it. Otherwise, this society is going to really move into some problematic kind of areas in the future, because we're in 2050 we're going to become a minority majority society, and I mean we've really got to get a handle on this misinformation and how people are just buying in.
I have a question from the audience or a comment. James, has your question been answered? You also come up with a comment, a fun fact. Iowa City just renamed the city park for him. I'm not sure who the him is you're referring to. And
James
then your comment. I'm
James,
sorry.
James McPherson.
Oh, okay. All right. Wow, front lash. That's a powerful concept term. I remember that. Are there any other questions from the audience? But I have a few more. Why, Professor Walker, do you think basketball is so important?
Why is basketball so important? I can only speak from my personal experience. I think in some ways it's a proving ground. I mean, if you're raised on the South Side of Chicago without many material goods, and if you suspect that your opportunities may not be the same for other people in wealthier communities, then one way that you can prove who you are, and dare I even say your masculinity in the case of young men growing up in that community, you do it on the court. And it was a way of saying, I can handle anything that is thrown my way in this space. And I would like for a lot of young men to see in that community, as I didn't see as soon as I would have liked, that same philosophy applies in other realms. That you can take on any opponent with the same intensity and the same aggression and the same drive as you can on the court. But when I was 14, 15, 16 years old, you lived and died with that basketball, and you could not return home in any good standing if you let someone put a move on you that caused you some humiliation. And so you had to show your worth on the court. And I think if you didn't have a whole lot of ways to have control of your life and a whole lot of ways to show your manhood, that was where it was done. And that was the importance of it for me when I was growing up. And just to show how that philosophy doesn't exactly transfer, I thought it was very important for my kids to know how to play basketball. And so I put up my rim in my backyard here in our 96.6 white community. And I said, I'm going to show you boys how to ball. And after I threw my youngest on a pass and it hit him on the back of the head and he fell and he busted his chin open and he got stitches, that was the end of that. So the same urgency to prove yourself on the blacktop does not exist in this community as it did in the community in which I was raised.
I'm trying to get to some more questions. Bear with me. I agree, Dr. Berry. This is the question. I agree, Dr. Berry. If anything, CRT merely allows different people / groups to be included more in American history.
Yeah, I mean, we've known for many years that you know, American history taught in K through 12 has been very limited in relation to, you know, the African American experience, and you know, so including some elements of critical race theory, like I said, it's been turned into the boogeyman. But it's really not. It's really just helping us understand that African Americans have, you know, had an impact on this society in a variety of different ways. And, you know, it's been limited in the sense of, you know, Dr. Martin Luther King and Black History Month and that kind of thing. But there's so many other elements in relation to Black culture that are prominent in our society. I can't tell you how many Black students who take my courses in African American studies at the University of Iowa have told me, wow, you know, I never knew that. I never, you know, I've never understood that. I've never, you know, nobody ever told me that, because, you know, they don't get it. They don't get it in K through 12. And so what they're doing is they're learning about a history that does not include them in any significant way. There was a controversy a few years ago, and I don't know whatever happened because I didn't keep up with it, but I guess it was Texas was trying to, they were going to adopt some new history books. And I guess the book was calling, let's see, it stopped calling slavery, slavery, and it was calling it, God, I can't remember that at this moment. But it was calling it something more like, you know, trade, continental trade or something, some ridiculous term, you know, to get away from the concept, the loaded concept of slavery. And like I said, I don't remember the term exactly, and I probably got it all wrong. But, you know, just helping us understand that, you know, slavery, yes, slavery was bad. Yes, slavery, the 1619 Project that Nicole Hannah-Jones talks about, which trace some of the elements of slavery, some of the negative, particularly elements of slavery that we still deal with today. it's not a reason to, dismantle it or dismiss it. It's a reason to look for ways to change it, to improve it, to make things better. And that's what I think is a problem is, we really need to focus on how do we make things better? How do we change things so that we all can feel good about being Americans in this society?
Professor Hicks, how do you like your position in the 400 Souls, contemporary history of African Americans between 1619 and 2019? Why did you choose to be included in that volume? Why was it important?
Yeah, so Professor Berry just made reference to the 1619 Project, which is the other kind of major piece that's commemorating this moment of 400 years since the arrival of probably not the first Africans in North America. We know that, for instance, with the Spanish conquistadors decades earlier, people of African descent had already arrived in places like Florida. But probably some of the earliest people to arrive here enslaved and intended to work in plantation labor. So it's really marking this moment. And I wanted to join it for several reasons. Firstly is the sort of quality of the editors, which, when you're a writer, I don't know if there's any writers still on the Zoom call, but it's really important to have good editors to work with, I think, who are thoughtful and who'll give you useful feedback. And the second thing is, I think I've noticed, especially because I do a lot of my research in Brazil, that there's really a lack of memorialization of this moment of the history of slavery. And I think that there needs to be, because we can't move forward unless we understand what happened in the past. That is my view. And, James Baldwin has a wonderful quote that says, we have to understand our history. We can't be a captive to it. But if you build your current moment on lies and falsehoods and myths, they'll crumble beneath your feet, basically. And you won't be able to do the things that you need to do. So I think both the 1619 Project and 400 Souls volume are an attempt to understand this really complex history that's about power, that's about exploitation, but it's also about, as Professor Walker was alluding to, it's about resilience and ingenuity. And about all the things that people of African descent have done to transform, our democracy, our world. And so it's also a celebration of that. And I think it's really important for young people, especially, to have access to these stories, because if we don't memorialize this history, then I just don't see a way, forward for us as a collective.
Prairie Lights, I can't reach the other questions 11 through 14. Can you read those questions?
Yes. So the last 4 questions on the Q&A.
Yes.
Okay. So B. Hicks asks, which of our virtues as African Americans is most necessary to assist us in our quest for full equality in American society?
Could you repeat the question?
Sure. Which of our virtues as African Americans is most necessary to assist us in our quest for full equality in American society? That's what B. Hicks asks.
Can I just jump in really quickly with my answer, just based on listening to the other panelists? I would say imagination, because if you can think outside the constraints of what exists in the present moment to something else, I think that's a really powerful thing.
I agree with that. I'm gonna go with improvisation. The ability to adjust to whatever obstacles are before you and find a way around them. It has always been a trait of African Americans and people who are oppressed to maneuver and to find ways to defeat the antagonist, and that's something that I think is vital to our survival.
And I guess my response would be engagement. Many of us have become too lackadaisical, and we kind of just accept whatever is out there and whatever is given to us. And I think we need to pay more attention. We need to be more active about what we accept, and we need to be more vocal about what we reject. You know, a lot of people, I'm not saying you have to go out and march with Black Lives Matter, although that's a good thing. But, you know, it could be something as simple as writing a letter to the editor in your newspaper, you know, about some issue that's going on that you feel strongly about. It could be joining a group that, you know, is making the kinds of changes that you want to see made. I mean, we need to become active again. And my daughter fusses at me all the time because she says, you know, the baby boomer generation, yes, we were out there civil rights fighting, and then we got comfortable. And so we kind of stepped back. So we need to get back in the fight. That's the bottom line. We need to get back in the fight.
Prairie Lights.
So James P. has not necessarily questions, but some comments. Says Texas, at least on the state government level right now, is going backwards. I said that a bit earlier. And then also makes a comment, says Baldwin is great. A problem with a lot of cultures around the world is a certain ahistoricity. So I'm not sure if anyone wants to speak to these comments. Maybe talk about what exactly ahistoricity means for you.
I think that question has Dr. Berry and Dr. Hicks written all over it. So I'll defer.
Well, I mean, I think, you know, historians have a very academic definition of what history is. I think we need to be a little bit more expansive because, you know, even with the stories Professor Walker shared, that kind of communal memory of what it means to be part of a community and the values of that community, I would consider to be historicity in a way, because it's the stories we tell about ourselves, about who we are and what our values are. You know, I would say that ahistoricity for me would be, and this is part of the attack on critical race theory, is to understand ourselves as just these kind of atomized individuals. We carry with us legacies of the past, and we have to understand how those legacies play out in our life and the choices we make. And this is not about assigning blame to people, which is what I think the critics of critical race theory don't understand. Critical race theory is not about individuals being bad or good. It's about everyone acting within the constraints of structures of race, class, gender, etc. And so it's only by understanding those structures and the histories of them that we can understand how to transform them, I would say.
And for me, you know, not being a historian, I've argued that, you know, today, you know, my focus is on right now. Every time you turn on the television or watch a film or get on social media or, you know, any other mediated element that you have in your life, you got to pay attention. You got to get involved. You got to, you know, try to make changes for those things that are problematic, for those things that, you know, are influencing Black culture in a negative way. We've got to start changing things because as we, you know, one of the things I argue about all the time, and it's funny because I didn't do a lot of it in this book on racialism in the media, but I should have. But this is a book in itself, is this whole, you know, the evolution of hip hop and, you know, going from Queen Latifah and, you know, this whole, you know, Black race positive to, you know, the bitches and hoes and bling blinging and all of that kind of thing. And when you have those images and those stereotypes that are repetitive, we see them all the time, over and over, and they're intertextual, you see them everywhere, then we all kind of drop our guard and we begin to accept them. So I'm not a historian, I'm a contemporarian. And I think that today we need to pay attention to the images and the messages that we are receiving, that our kids are receiving, that our grandkids are receiving, and really try to make a difference because, our brains, we're not empty buckets with stuff being dumped into us. People are critical, people do accept and reject certain things, but there's a lot of stuff that we buy into because it's just so normalized in our society.
I'd like to ask Professor Berry to elaborate further because you do a whole chapter on Black Twitter.
Well, but I look at Black Twitter from a perspective of one of the things that I'm very impressed with on Black Twitter is that it does do a really good job of expanding the Black voice. Black Twitter has incited protests. It's given voice to various issues that are going on in our society. It's creating the kinds of attention that needs to be created on certain kinds of situations. And then of course there's also the other stuff, the funny stuff, that Black Twitter does. But my point is that it's offering Black culture a different way to influence or impact society. And I'm always very positive when it comes to that kind of opportunity. Anybody can get on Black Twitter and can get their point across, get their voice heard. And I think that that's important. I think that that's the kind of change we need in this society.
We have a compliment from Judy Clinton. What a wonderful convergence of stories, pictures, convergence of stories. What a wonderful convergence of stories. Pictures of the maritime men and theory observations. And she thanks Perry Lights for putting this together. And the next question is, Dr. Hicks, do you write about the relationship that developed between the Portuguese enslavers and the enslaved in other texts that you can share with us?
Yeah, I have a few other pieces that are related, are interconnected to the story I tell in 400 Souls. My book should be coming out next year, which it's called Captive Cosmopolitans, so look for that. But I'm also in volumes including The Many Faces of Slavery. There's an upcoming volume on medicine during the age of slavery, in which I discuss Black medical practitioners and how they introduced African ideas about the body and healing into Brazil in the 18th and early 19th century. And I also have a piece in a journal called Slavery and Abolition, called Transatlantic Threads of Meaning, which is about the exchange of cloth between West Africa and Brazil, and how especially enslaved women who are African-born or of African descent transformed the ideas about the power that cloth had to signify certain kinds of identity and religious authority. So those are other places you can check out my writing. Thanks for the question.
Thank you. Perry Lights, do we have any more questions?
Looks like we do have one final question from Ron Adkins. This is also for Dr. Hicks. The direction you take in the study of history of global slavery shattered my perception of this part of our culture. Could you elaborate on the motivations of Africans to be a trading partner in the slave trade? What could possibly compel someone to enslave a brother or sister?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I think the way that I discuss this, especially with my students, because it is a very ethically fraught issue, is to say that these people did not consider themselves as enslaving brothers and sisters, much in the same way that it's easy for us to objectify people who aren't like us, who speak different languages, who look different, who have different cultures. It's easier for us to distance ourselves from them. that was also true in the era of the slave trade, in which people enslaved people who did not share their ethnicity, who did not share their language, their kinship relation, their political affiliation. And so what you see in transatlantic slaving in West Africa is that there is no concept of Blackness in Africa before the modern period and colonialism, which occurs in the 19th century. And instead, there are all these very diverse forms of difference that exist, that people, don't affiliate with others who they see as unlike them. But I think one of the things that we can't lose sight of is that oftentimes historical processes take on a life of their own. So while initially you might participate to a limited extent in the transatlantic slave trade, soon you become dependent on it, and you become dependent on the trade goods, especially, that are coming in: guns, money, shell money, cloth, etc., from European merchants in order to maintain your own political power. And that's how a lot of people become ensnared in participating in the transatlantic slave trade.
I wanted to, I just looked up the concept I was thinking about with the Texas and the slave trade, the changes in the book. They called it patterns of immigration, and they were calling slaves immigrants, workers, unpaid interns, everything but taking it out of the concept of slavery, which that's fascinating to me.
Paid interns.
Shall we start with closing comments? Dr. Berry, would you like to begin?
Well, basically, like I said, what I'm trying to do, I understand that there are still ugly racists, and they push even uglier racism out there. But I am really wanting us to kind of create to look at it from a nuanced perspective, to understand that there are popular constructions of race that are routinely woven into the media, various mediated images and messages. And so we need to really kind of begin to distinguish those images and messages. And my other issue is that too often the loaded notion of traditional racism leads us to a kind of extreme historical and emotional abyss. We push it into this state. We're pushed into a state of negativity, fear, hatred when we think about racism. And in my opinion, when we focus on those kinds of extremes, we miss really important elements of racialism that, in my opinion, are just as powerful, just as problematic. And I didn't get to show the images, but there are other images that I talk about with my class, where Pine Sol has an ad series with an African-American woman, a heavyset African-American woman, where she is, in the mammy stereotype, but they do a twist on the mammy. And so she's holding the bottle of Pine Sol, but she's decked out in this, this silk gown, and she has her hair done, really nicely, and her makeup's done, and so she's not the typical image of a mammy stereotype. Even though she's advertising for Pine Sol, it's a twist. And I think those kinds of things are interesting. There's another one real quickly that Tide does, where there's a Black male, and he's in a white t-shirt on white sheets, and he's laying there asleep on the bed with his son, a baby son, laying on his chest. And it's just an ad for Tide. And, we so often see those negative stereotypes of Black men, and we hear those negative ideologies of Black men not taking care of their kids. And it's just such a powerful image of race that ties into the concept, in my opinion, of racialism, outside of racist, but, looking at how race and media interact.
Thank you, Dr. Berry. How about Dr. Hicks?
So closing thoughts, not so much about my work, but just gratitude for this event, for Prairie Lights for hosting it. It's really exciting to be part of an event at a bookstore that I used to go to as a young child. And my access to books as a kid is what allowed me to become a writer. So support your independent bookstore, support your local library, because those are all spaces in which kids can engage with all this, these world of ideas that I think is so important for children especially. And I guess my closing thought would be, because we talked a lot about contemporary controversies, about discussions of race that are happening right now, is that go to the source material. That's what I would recommend for anyone. If you're curious about critical race theory, you should read the work of critical race theorists. If you're curious about Black history, you should read the work of Black historians who are writing about Black history. If you're curious about, the real world contemporary context, you can look at the work of Black sociologists and Black authors. So I would say go to the source. Don't let anyone tell you what to think about it. And I think we're actually in a really rich moment in which people are writing a lot of interesting works about race. So we should take advantage of that.
Thank you, Dr. Hicks. Professor Walker?
Yes, let me echo what Professor Hicks just said about being grateful for this opportunity. Prairie Lights is awesome. I wish I could be there in person. I miss Iowa City. People don't understand when I talk about how fantastic Iowa City is. My wife and I lived there for over 10 years, and we did not want to leave. And if I could go back tomorrow, which is to say, if the University of Iowa would hire me, I would do it. So Dr. Berry, make some calls.
I was getting ready to say, we're going to work on that now that you said it. Everybody heard you.
I want to go back. I want to go back to Iowa City. This has been a great event. I learned a whole lot more than I anticipated, and I'm grateful for that. The conversations were fantastic. And on this whole notion of stereotypes and racialism, it's kind of the thing that butters my bread. It's what I write about constantly, and I'm always trying to find some new ways to approach this material. And mainly I focus on ways that African Americans can look at these topics and see what we can do to find solutions to problems, rather than spending a whole lot of time of trying to get the problem makers to stop making the problems. I like to outsmart my opponents, which brings me to someone I mentioned before, Albert Murray, who coined a phrase, antagonistic cooperation. And what he meant by that is that without the dragon, we cannot perfect our ability to do battle. And he specifically talked about matadors, and that what matadors never do and cannot do is to protest the existence of the bull. The bull is the bull. The bull will do what bulls are supposed to do, which is to try to kill you. So rather than saying, bull, please stop, you have to perfect your skills as a matador in order to slay the bull. And that's what I focus on in my work. That's what I believe all people who come from oppressed groups should focus on. Master the techniques of the matador, down the bull.
Thank you very much. I want to thank Prairie Lights for this opportunity and turn it back over to them.
Thank you, Mr. Daniels. Yeah, I want to thank everyone. First of all, the panelists, for sharing your knowledge and your time. And this was just, incredibly wonderful to be a part of and to witness. So thank you so much, all of you. Thank you, Mr. Daniels, for being a fantastic moderator and for your work on this event as well. And thank you everyone for coming and providing these wonderful questions and spending your Saturday morning with us. So I hope you have a wonderful rest of the day. If you're in Iowa City, stop by Prairie Lights, pick up some books, learn more, keep the conversation going. And just, yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.